lives. So archives really do run the gamut of everything that we do in terms of commemorating and honoring those from the past. The types of archives that I've worked with traditionally as a public historian here in the city have been formal archives. I go into repositories such as the one here at the library, or Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library, or the Schomburg Center up in Harlem. And I look at archives that have been put together by professional archivists. I sort of, dismiss or reject the idea that historians, public historians, any kind of historian, researcher finds things in the archive. The reason you're able to pull those collections of archives out is because an archivist has put a lot of love and care into it, has labeled it, and has given it a catalog number, has given it some sort of finding aid, and therefore you have been able to find it. So you haven't actually found anything. And so those are the kinds of archives I work with. I also work with, as a public historian, if there are churches or religious centers or family archives, and critically, I get the invitation. I never invite myself to somebody's party or somebody's house, but if I get the invitation, I'm always happy to sort of research or look there and think about how we put these narratives of New Yorkers' past together. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for having us as well, and thank you for having us and for all the work that's gone into this. So, I have, in a sense, similar to Priti, I've worked in traditional archives where you go, you make an appointment, you go through files, you go slowly. And so I think that is one critical way. I would say often sometimes archaeologists, not like the ones that maybe Kelly is training or in her background, but archaeologists I work in the Mediterranean, they have often been a group that's maybe a little resistant to going to archives because they'd rather be in the field digging things up. And in fact, archives can be a really critical way that we access people from the past that don't show up in published form records. So traditionally for excavations that have occurred in Syria or Egypt or Jordan, many times the people actually excavating for local residents who worked, or in multiple generations of families who were excavators, who worked with foreign archaeologists. Those people generally never showed up in excavation reports, but now that people are starting to go to archives, those people are now starting to come back into the narrative so that we can understand their contributions to archaeology. So that's really important. But I would also say that the other thing that people can work on is the formation of archives in a collaborative way. And that's one thing that I spent a lot of time doing, it started in about 2010, working with other colleagues to put together a photo archive of archaeological sites in the Middle East and parts of North Africa and Western Asia. And part of that was kind of motivated by the fact that recently now you can get a lot more images for publication and work with them. But back then, which now is like 15 plus years ago, there was a lot of proprietary control over images. And to publish images or work with images, you had to get high resolution ones and you'd have to pay for them. And like $100 an image gets really super expensive really fast. So that was one piece. But also that many people who work in those regions in North Africa and West Asia, it's much easier for an American to visit different countries. I can get a visa to Egypt. I can get a visa to Jordan. I got visas to Syria before the war without a problem. But somebody in Jordan can't get a visa to Egypt. Somebody in Egypt can't get a visa to Syria, because usually the governments can often be somewhat suspicious of why an archaeologist might be needing to go to another site, which we would never doubt as archaeologists. So one of the things that we thought to do, working with colleagues where I went to grad school in the UK, was to put together an archive of high-resolution photos all the way down to low-res, have them labeled in English and in Arabic, so multiple populations could use them, and then try and collect as many images of archaeological sites, basically going from Morocco all the way to Syria. And no one person can do that, but there was a group of us who were very dedicated working together to put this together. So now there are about 90,000 images in the photo, and so photos together in the archive. And so that can be a type of archive you can do. Now that's a very particular, very archaeological one. And so it was done by a bunch of highly trained academics, partially because we can tell you, like, oh, it looks like a bunch of columns. Well, maybe a specific group of columns. But also trying to document that region often gets very contentious of whether you're documenting something that is pagan, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. And if we can document all of them, then people can use them in different ways. it also then becomes documentation of multiple groups living in regions together that often are very contentious today. And so it also meant that because it was totally free, people could use it any way that they wanted to, whether they were going to teach with a class or publish something scholarly. So I think that was one of the reasons why we started doing this, because of commitment to make sure that our colleagues who did not have the means to maybe travel could access photos that they needed for their work, and also to encourage people to think about it. So that was one thing. And then I do a lot with Smart History, the Center for Public Art History, which aims to basically do videos and essays that I think we have over 800 contributors. I'm the chair of the board and I'm acquiring editor and I write for them too, but also to basically make a lot of these different types of art accessible. And for that, we need free images. So this commitment to making things accessible and open, this is one of the pluses of some of the newer archives that we can try to create, and how that knowledge can become accessible to more different people, and different types of knowledge can then be created. So it's not maybe a traditional archive, but it's also about one of the things we can do digitally, which makes it kind of, so that's kind of
Wow, that's great. That's thought.
So,
Marianne.
thank you for coming, and I'm just honored to be part of this presentation today. And I'm coming at it from the inside as an archivist, as someone who works in a formal archive. I can tell you how I see it, and just build upon what has already been said. And yeah, it is this collection of records, and we have 7 levels of storage, and we're the second largest CUNY archive, and it's just miles and miles of paper and artifacts, etc. But it's more than that. And what really makes it an archive is the people from the inside, the archivists, the interns, people who work on the stuff when we get it in, who do the appraisal, who do the organization, who do the cataloging, create the finding aids to make it accessible. And then on the other side of what I see is the researcher. And you have that formal researcher, someone who's a PhD, someone who's been doing this all the time, to someone who's just interested in family history, or students, someone who is just kind of like an amateur, unsure about everything. But what I really feel that makes it an archive is people using the documents, people interpreting the documents in different ways, and how we see how people use them and publish them, how students use them. And also, we get to see and understand a different side of it by asking people about their research. So we get to know what we have and what gaps there are, and where we can build things, like stuff like the Listening Project, or asking people to contribute stuff from their own collections or things that they have, or reaching out to alums or different offices. But to me, it's a process that's always moving, transitioning. It has a momentum. And I would love, what I see is to break down a lot of the barriers, because we've all had experiences with libraries, right? When we're little kids, we get taken to the library, we have library in school, we're part of a program, we go and get our books out. But how many of us, how many of the Brooklyn College students, how many people in our community, how many of our relatives know or even been inside an archive? My family didn't even know what I was doing when I said that I was going to be an archivist and I was going to go to library school. Like, what is this, So there is still that barrier, that fear, especially in a formal archive, that you got to go, you got to sign in, you got to put your bags in a locker, you're given these boxes, you have to then interpret these primary sources, and are you finding everything and you don't realize the time, and it can be overwhelming. And that's why I think that it has to also be a collaborative effort, that faculty need to help students, that we as archivists need to educate people on how to use archives, that we need to work with our partners with public history to make this stuff more accessible, to make there less of a barrier, to make it more equitable, to try to, get rid of some of these barriers or the gaps or the omissions, or, kind of the power structures that exist in the creation of archives.
Wow, those were all wonderful, amazing answers. And I love the sort of thread that goes through all three. You talk about accessibility component, which I think all of us can kind of relate to, whether it's accessibility to something that isn't digitized and you need to be able to digitize it, or making it accessible as you were stating with your collaborative work for people that can't even access this stuff, right? But I also like this aspect of an archive as something that you use, as you so eloquently pointed out, but also one that can be made, right? And I think that is something that sometimes eludes a lot of people when they think of archives, that it is actually something that you have the power to do, right? Whether it's using other documents and creating a sort of sub-archive, as you would, or creating your own, whether it's through like family records stuff. How many people in the audience have like family records that they keep, or family photos in an album, right? You're already starting your own archive. Or even ones with like friends, right? Do you have a keepsake box with like friends, fun notes and so forth? Yes, exactly. That's an archive, right? So it's just, I love how this really can touch everyone in some way, shape, or form. So another point that I wanted to sort of ask you is to sort of get into all your work that you're doing right now, whether it's research work or whether in Marianne's case, whether you're working on a particular project in the archive, but exactly what is your relationship with the archive right now? I'm going to talk about relationships. Right? And maybe if you could highlight what your favorite moment in an archive was. I know what mine is, one of mine is, and I was so excited I had to call somebody in the middle of it. It was great, but I want to pass it on. Let's start first with, we'll go backwards now. And Marianne, if you want to kickstart us off. So what sort of project are you working on now, and what's your favorite moment in the archive?
Well, actually, what I usually do is work on a lot of projects at once. You know, we all have a lot of, balls in the air. We're trying to prioritize because we wear many different hats.
Yeah.
You know, especially in CUNY, things are underfunded. You never have enough staff. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to visit the Rockefeller Archive Center. And this is something that is funded beyond your wildest imaginations in this huge mansion. And they've got over 40 people working there. And they have teams of people that just work on education, that just work on digitization, that just work on processing, etc. But, you know, most of the time when you work in an archive, and I know that, you know, this is not just for CUNY, that you're trying to balance and do a lot of things. So, you know, typical work week for me is, I would call, like, it's partially physical and it's partially mental. You know, there's a lot of schlepping. There's a lot of retrieving boxes. There's, you know, what I'm working on, like I'll just give you just this week. How about that? Like Monday, I spent time in the lower level going through boxes that had gotten wet and they were all moldy. And what do you do with this stuff? And what can be saved? And how do you deal with getting rid of sensitive documents that are moldy? Most of these hard questions I, you know, send over to my boss. It's good to be number two, right? Sometimes, right? You know, and so you deal with things like that. I have chat questions, reference questions, students coming in, boxes to pull, you know, all these crazy Zoom meetings that you're always afraid you miss one, right? Or am I the only person that thinks that they don't have a, you know, and you have interns and students and, you know, just people who work for you that you're just trying to answer their questions, making sure they have something to do, making sure the archives just runs as smoothly as possible. And sometimes, I don't know, people realize this, not only does it take a lot of time for a research, if you're coming as on the research end, you know, hey, it's going to take you weeks or whatever to go through all these boxes. A lot of times it could take me days to even answer a question that I get, even something that's just simple, like, when did someone teach here? Or, you know, or I did my brother graduate from Brooklyn College or something like that. We get internal questions, external questions. And you could spend a lot of time going through boxes and doing stuff. But I think one of the best descriptions of what I do and the work that I do was someone who worked for us that is recently retired. She worked for us for a few years. Her name was Teresa. And one time she created a song about the archives that was based on Josie and the Pussycats.
Oh, I love it.
And the song was Marianne and the Archivettes. It was all about schlepping, but one of the best lines, which is totally true, because archives is not squeamish, because we go and collect things from the worst places, because, you know, it's important to save these records, was dusty, dirty, moldy, and turdy, archivettes get down and dirty. I'm not going to sing it for you, though everybody knows I usually sing. You know, so I'm sorry I got...
I think that's your new tagline.
Yeah.
That should be
Email
my,
signature.
my
Exactly.
tagline. So that's basically, and my favorite moment in the archives. It's very hard because I've worked there for over 30 years, so it's hard to come up with something that's specific, but I would say that my favorite moments are when I come across something unexpected in the archive, and it makes me not only, you know, it's not only interests me in my little historical mind, but I see it as something that could be a project for students, or some piece of Brooklyn College history that for whatever reason has not been discussed or suppressed or needs to be known, or projects that students could have. Like, for example, all the stuff that I find about the early student protest movements, like the National Student League at Brooklyn College, and these students that got together with other schools in New York City and had these just amazing conferences, protests. There's one story where the students decided to go to a striking mining camp in Kentucky in the 30s. And they just rented these buses and they go down there. And of course, they were stopped at the Tennessee border by cops. And they were taken out of these buses. They were beaten up. They were arrested. And how, you know, what they went through to just stand in solidarity with other students, with people in the country with issues, national issues in the city and the state that meant a lot to them. And I see this, that not only we should talk about it, but it's something that could resonate with the students today. And it's something that needs to be discussed. And not just the usual things that they discuss about Brooklyn College, but all of kind of like this messy, sloppy, you know, things that might have been good, bad, you know, not just the happy usual things that the college likes to talk about. So, I'm sorry.
No, it's a great story. I thought you were going to mention the ghosts. I'm
Oh,
not
the
going to bring
ghost?
up
Well,
the
I
ghosts.
talk about the ghost all the time, so I said,
That's okay. Yeah.
you know, I don't know if but the ghost was a good way to get people interested in the archives, because it's kind of a hook. Like, meet the ghost, but also learn about the archives.
Exactly. If you want to learn about the ghost, you can talk to Marianne after the event. Definitely a big hit. Lindsay.
It's hard to go after a ghost.
Yeah.
Now I'm intrigued. Okay. So, you know, it's kind of, I guess I'm going to start with, I guess my favorite moment in the archives, because it kind of spawned, it has taken on a life of its own. And so it started when at first I was looking at things on the New York City Parks website, probably in like 2012. And there was this column that happened to be in Queens, and it was from Jash. And I looked at it and I was like, well, that's weird. Jash is a city in Jordan. It's a Greco-Roman city, peaked in kind of the mid-2nd century CE. So I was like, that's super random. What is that doing in Queens? I mean, Queens is a place I think of like incredible diversity, incredible food, so many different things, but not a column. And so I found out that it was from the 1964-65 World's Fair. Everything in my life is currently related or spawned by World's Fairs. My poor children. Poor children. But what was interesting was that I realized, of course, there were archives about the World's Fair, and they were all held, large portions of the operation records were held at New York Public Library. There are also additional things in Queens and other places too. And so I went to go see why this column ended up here, because there was a plaque. The plaque said it was from it was a whispering column from Jash. And I was like, okay, I know which temple that's supposed to be for, but that column looks short. But fine, I'll go read in the archive. And so very kindly sent a message to New York Public Library, like, please come. And we're like, yes, you can come. We have all these linear feet of boxes. And the point that like some librarians did a lot of schlepping to get these beautiful boxes out for me to look at. And then I'm starting to read about the Jordan Pavilion And it turns out the column was sent as a gift from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to New York City. And the people who were responsible for it got sent the wrong column, but didn't want to tell Robert Moses. Nobody wants to tell
Can't
Robert
say I
Moses.
blame them.
I would do exactly the same thing because Robert Moses isn't going to know the difference. But I was very intrigued, which those of you who not, Robert Moses is, yeah, I mean, such a problem, but such a figure that impacts New York City. And so, like, his fingers are in so many things. We're still dealing with ramifications of his policies from, the 30s to the 60s. He gave up his job as the Parks Commissioner to take this job at the World's Fairs, at the 64, 65 World's Fair, partially because he wanted to make a larger park, but also I guess he had better medical benefits, and his daughter was sick, so that's why he did it. Just like a humanizing moment. Yeah, interesting. But I was so struck by this and the fact that the column wasn't the correct column, and then I started reading more about these columns because it seemed like turned out the Jordanians Philadelphia got a column, and there were capitals given to Harvard, Princeton, and Penn, and so I was like, this seems to be an interesting form of soft power diplomacy, but how do we bring this interesting story to life? Why are they doing this? What does the Jordanian pavilion look like at the fair? And so I started to get interested in these larger questions of how do ancient objects, how do they relate to this modern world? How are they being used? And how are different countries leveraging their kind of cultural heritage and past to forge relationships or different relationships with, Americans, with the U.S. government, with different entities. And so because it made me laugh that the column was not the one they were expecting. They didn't tell anybody, which I thought was funny. But then it started to this larger question of like, how are there different stories that one can tell that are either coming from World's Fairs or that are coming this intersection of archaeology, soft power, cultural diplomacy. And so I just kept kind of going into that, and that has resulted in some book projects, but then also stuff for Smart History. We've done videos, and then a newer relationship where there's this thing called the Science and Diplomacy Group, and they work on science and diplomacy. And actually, archaeology has a lot of intersections there, and so I started talking to them about how archaeology has intersected in certain places in other parts of the world as tools of diplomacy where people have worked together to try and build bridges. I mean, until very recently, a lot of the excavations funded in Egypt were funded by the U.S. State Department. So what are these stories that people don't know? What are other agendas? Archaeologists might have a pure motive, but does the State Department? And how do we think about these questions? And so some of those will be scholarly publications, but then also talking with different communities and then putting things on Smart History as well, because it's so much fun. It's so much fun, and it makes such a difference for sharing these different types of stories and knowledge for us to allow to kind of do different types of archaeology and art history, so that it isn't just defined in a very narrow range, which I think is a really critical thing, which is expanding all aspects of history or art history or archaeology to be really, universal, and not to just be talking about what are traditionally valued as like specific moments in history. So that's one of those things where I think an archive can take you through a number of iterations, and there are different venues, and it's really important to pursue, I think, all of those different ways of sharing information. So
I think that's great. The archive is the ultimate rabbit.
So I'll start with the archive story first, and then I'll move to what I'm doing right now. The archival story begins back in 2010. Prior to coming to CUNY, I've been at CUNY since 2012. I actually worked as a public historian at what was then Brooklyn Historical Society, which no longer exists. It's now Center for History at Brooklyn Library, and a project, a partnership with Weeksville Heritage Center, which very much exists and is thriving still, and Irondale Ensemble Project, which is a theatre company out in Green. And the project was called In Pursuit of Freedom, Brooklyn Abolitionists. And the cultural organizations had won an RFP from Bloomberg's administration going into de Blasio's to tell the story of Brooklyn's anti-slavery movement. All came about because I don't know how many of you know Duffield Street or Abolitionist Place. But a huge amount of organizing and advocacy and activism still going on today. Back in the early 2000s, a Brooklyn resident who has since passed, late Mama Joy Chattel, turned around to the city at a time when, I would say that's still being developed, but lots of downtown Brooklyn was being rezoned and stated that her home was part of the Underground Railroad. And because of the advocacy in the early 90s of the African burial ground over in Manhattan, the city is now obligated to research anything of historical value, either a burial ground or something like an Underground Railroad situation. And so the city did stop. They put together a panel of experts, of archaeologists, folklorists, of historians, to try and figure out the history of Duffield Street. And sure enough, they did. They figured out that 227 Duffield more than likely was on the Underground Railroad. And because of so much of what this city does, is they ended up raising most of that street. You can go today. It is now a park. But 227 Duffield, Joyce Chattel's home, still remains. All of that to say, I was brought on board as a public historian to tell the story of Brooklyn's abolitionists. Why Brooklyn? Well, Brooklyn was a separate city until consolidation in 1998. So it had a story to tell for too often, and it's no sort of shade at any other historians. For a long time in the, I would say, the 80s and 90s, scholars who would say that they were historians of New York really did mean Manhattan, and that Brooklyn was some sort of like a subchapter of its history. And so Brooklyn really was going to be the star of this public history project, and its unsung heroes was the framing, would be at the center of it. When you work in public history, you are not just working with the people who are employing you or giving you your salary. You're working with multiple community stakeholders. And so one of the stakeholders in Brooklyn Heights is Plymouth Church, a very famous church today, historic landmark, has a huge, rich, radical history. And one of their big figures is Henry Ward Beecher, a white abolitionist preacher who was at the center of Brooklyn's abolitionist movement. And because you're working with stakeholders, you know, the museum and its partners were very sort of careful or keen to make sure that Plymouth Church was given its flowers, right? That Henry Ward Beecher was celebrated as part of this narrative. But here's the ethical question for public historians. What do you do when the archives aren't supporting that narrative? Everything I was finding until that moment very much showed in Manhattan in the 19th century, where Black and white organizers, activists had come together to call for the immediate end to slavery and political and legal equality for people of African descent. That was not happening in Brooklyn. Brooklyn was, like Brooklyn still is, a very sort of doing its own thing, self-determined, Black people at the center of what a better world and future would look like. So it really was Black activism at its center. Henry Ward Beecher featured in no part of this movement until much later in the 1850s. And so there is a tension that exists in public history. I think that people sometimes don't actually talk about often enough, right? Because it is big institutions often funding this work, or big, not anymore, but back in the day, it used to be NEH, right? Mm-hmm. Big funders that have a lot of eyes on this work. All of this to say, you know, we went to, Yale has the Beecher family papers, so we did go up to Yale, me and my colleague Samantha Gibson, to look through these papers to try and put that story together and try and do it justice. One of the many stories of Henry Ward Beecher was he would do, label them himself, slave auctions. So he would get young girls, young Black girls, to come up to Brooklyn, to stand on his pulpit with him, and would auction them to his congregation, which sounds as hideous and complex and weird as it probably was for those young children. And so my colleague and I just wanted to kind of start scratching what that even meant, right? What does that mean that we celebrate this man, but that all of these young children are at the center of his narrative? And when we were looking, again, did not discover, reject that framing, but when we were looking through the family papers, we found a accounts book for a Black woman called Pomona Bryce, who had shown up in other parts of the research. And all of this to say, sometimes, and again, I apologize, I'm going for such touchy-feely like words at the moment, but there is a certain amount, I think, of spiritualism that sometimes happens in the archives, especially for researchers. Sometimes it's one of joy. Sometimes you burst into tears, and everybody in that reading room goes. And for me, it really was a moving moment in which Pomona Bryce, to me, came out of that archive and said, "This is my story, and it's my story to tell." Pomona Bryce was a Black woman living in Brooklyn whose family was still enslaved in the South. And she was fundraising constantly to emancipate her family members. And so her account book, right, because it was all capitalism, it was about how much money she could fundraise, showed she had been instrumental in raising the money to emancipate certain family members. And one of the many people that contributed to that fund was Henry Ward Beecher. So thinking through the ways in which we commemorate New Yorkers past, whose stories are we telling? How do we tell them? From whose perspective are we telling them? I think I always try and honor that Pomona Bryce moment in which she was coming to us saying, "This is my story to tell. It was never his." In terms of what I'm working on now, outside of CUNY and answering many emails, as a public historian, I'm still in downtown Brooklyn. There is an incredible artist called Pensive Armstead, phenomenal artist who is doing the other piece of that project that started a decade and a half ago, in Pursuit of Freedom. So his public art piece, True North, will be going up in Abolitionist Place.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it takes a long time. He got commissioned, I think, 3 years ago. It should be going up in theory next summer. And I think, again, the ways in which not just public history, but public historians can work with creatives and cultural workers to tell stories about our past. So that, to me, right, that creative piece is also a living archive, and it's going to be. It is beautiful. I think his sketches are up because it's the EDC and Cultural Affairs who are funding it. So that is what I'm working on now. I'm being a dorky historian.
I love it. It's wonderful. I love the way that you all talked about the power of the archive, and how sometimes that power needs to be. I'm totally behind you with the use of discovery. Yeah, I'm not about that, but unleashed in many ways, right? Like you're setting it free in a way that has been buried for so long, which I think really is pretty amazing. It's what. I've been in the archive and cried and, like I said, called people and so forth. So yes, I've had that spiritual moment. It's been pretty amazing. I would like to move on to this. One of the last few questions is this idea of, and we sort of alluded to it in a few of your points, of doing archival and public history now in this political moment. And thinking, we started sort of in a grounding way of the definitions. Now I want to think in more of a futuristic way, where do you see archives and public history moving in the future? As you stated, NEH, well, a lot of the funding institutions that we would go to be able to do this work is no longer available, or very, very little available. So what's next? What's our next sort of thoughts on this? I'm going to go middle on out. So,
I get the hard one.
I'm like shaking things up here. Yeah, we're archivists and public historians here. We're shaking.
Yeah.
I think it just is continuing. I mean, part of it I would say is like continuing to educate the next generation, and that part of it is understanding that everyone in this room has a right to be in an archive and to create an archive, and to understand that all types of information are relevant and important, not just ones that are traditionally identified as being important material. And so I think that the ability to understand and be cognizant, I know that everyone now seems to put everything on TikTok or social media or whatever, which is one way, but it's very ephemeral. All of those can somehow become also parts of archives as well. But thinking about what that means to you, and the fact that you as students, as members of these different communities, you have an ability to A, access those archives, and you should, and B, to document what you're doing, because you may not know what's important. You may not know what someone in the future is going to want or is going to want to understand. I mean, I think all of us desperately want to have X number of letters or books or things from other people who do not exist in the textual record. This is a constant issue because until very recently, the vast majority of humanity did not have the ability to read or write, and we value written sources way more sometimes than we do other types of documentation. So I think that it remains critical for doing those things, and for the kind of next generation to do them. And I think also, I think the other thing is also there are actually a lot of archives that are very accessible because they are digitized. And so one piece is the physically going and being involved, but also understanding that some of your first steps can actually happen from at home. And so if you're scared or worried that you don't belong, you can find a lot of information to start to understand that you can come and develop your own base of knowledge and go to those spaces. So I'm doing a lot of work on the UN's archives. There's so much of that is digitized. Yes, it takes you forever to go through it, but that's kind of the joy. That's the joy of going to the archive. It's like you can get lost and things like that. But I would say there may be places for you to even start. And the other thing is maybe if there is something that's important to you in your community, whether it's a church, whether it's a type of cultural center, those are places that need documentation. They need somebody to take them. Even if you're not a trained archivist, this could be your first way in and learning as a student to do that, to then go library school and library science school and become a librarian or become an archivist. So I think the thing is, like, you should believe in your own ability to contribute to the production of knowledge. It's not just somebody who's a professor or a librarian or an archivist. Anyone can produce knowledge, and you should have belief in yourselves to do that.
I love that. Great. All right.
Yeah, and I totally agree that we do need all of this participation from everyone, from the students, from the community. You know, yes, it's a bad political time, and it, you know, makes us angry or anxious or worrying about what's going to happen to records and what we can do. But I think we have to understand that the power lies with us. That, you know, we can, like has been said here, but we could create archives. We can become active participants, because to just be passive in our lives is not what is needed in this time. You know, we can walk around like this and be a cell phone stoner, or you can
Ooh, I love that.
and you can say, you know, I'm just going to try now, make this difference. Do I have the power? And it's yes. And you see communities getting together, creating their own archives. Movements in like field of curatorial repair, where people are looking into, you know, how archives, the wording archives use, the cataloging, you know, what's collected, what's there, who's doing this collecting, how can we, you know, we change the narrative here, and but it needs everyone's help, and like you said, you don't need to be a professional. And I'm just going to give you 2 examples from just my own experience, because you know, where I work in Brooklyn College and CUNY. So one is the 100th anniversary is coming up. You know, I couldn't not talk about the 100th anniversary, because all I talk about is 2030.
Of Brooklyn College.
Brooklyn College. Now, there hasn't been much administration interest in this, and this is something that I alone, even though I'm very loud, I don't have the ability to change. And I know it's going to happen. In 2029, someone's going to knock on the archives door, and they're going to be like, what are we going to do? And they're going to do the same. I told the team I'd keep my language. The same thing that they did for the 50th, that they did for the 70th, 75th. They're going to get some dudes dressed like FDR and LaGuardia and have them roll out in some old car and reenact the groundbreaking. They did it at the 50th, they did it at the 75th.
We're going to stop it for the 100th.
And I would say if they want to do it, let them. But we're going to do our own. I need everybody's help, everybody's advocacy to make this 100th anniversary ours. Listen, all you people here, you're going to be alumni. This is your history. Do you want some dude that is like making 6 figures off campus, zooming it in, telling you what Brooklyn College is? Or do you want someone else telling your history? Do you want someone else telling it? All right, you want to talk about that? Let's talk about all of the speeches before the politicians came. Let's talk about the speeches at the groundbreaking, where everyone talked about the fear of the rise of fascism, and the only hope was this free, public, liberal education. Can we turn the narrative? Can we make it our branding? Can we talk about the protests or the students or the constituents that have been left out of Brooklyn College history in all these official publications over and over and over again throughout the years? You know, let's talk about how the fight to create Brooklyn College, that there were all these editorials that these crazy socialists wanted to create another free college in Brooklyn. I mean, what is going on here? So, and then, you know, so it's always like, yeah, there's archives and we have like a big orange bugaboo that we know about. But there's also people in power that control archives, that control the branding, that control the narrative, that they have the ability, the power, the resources, the moolah to say, this is what Brooklyn College is, or this is what CUNY is, and this is the mythology that I want to create. But we have to be active and have our own voices in it. If they don't want to do it, we need to do it. We need to take charge of it. And I'm going to tell you another sad story, if I have a minute
You have
to
a
tell.
minute, and then we need to move on.
Okay.
To another one.
That
Love
CUNY
your
doesn't
story.
care about their archive either. And they get, you know, and there's no CUNY archivist. They've only had someone for 3 years. They're getting rid of this person, and nobody knows what's going to happen to the massive storage of the untouched CUNY archives in LaGuardia Community College. Is it going to be destroyed? We have to advocate for the archives of CUNY, because I think these big wigs don't care if that stuff is destroyed, but we do.
Thank you. That was great. Get this woman a sign and put it
When the revolution began.
the archival revolution. Yes. Forget about the agricultural revolution.
Well, I hope the centenary celebrations go. Thank you for that. I think I would just echo what my two esteemed panelists said, which is everything is in community. I write about community, I research community, and my practice and my work is always in community, meaning if you are interested in archives or research, find your peoples, find your community to work with. True public public history, public humanities, whatever that public is, should feel multi-authored, multi-collaborative, multi-everything, in which you are constantly sharing research with one another. The public history circle in New York City is extremely small, especially those who work on New York City's past and its free Black communities, for example. And so if I get a gig and I can't do it, I will always recommend somebody else. And I think, to speak to Lizzie's point, that is part of, you know, being middle-aged and mentoring the next folks who are going to come in and do this work, and making sure there is a place for them, especially right now, where those spaces have kind of disappeared in this particular political moment. I would also just shout out the work that is happening. There is work happening constantly. You know, I think of archives existing on social media. Nueve Pinos exists on Instagram. Kinfolk Tech are young people doing brilliant stuff. There are also, you know, I really, again, reject this idea of the traditional archive and archive interference, because it is often our friends and colleagues and comrades who are the same people doing the work, right? They work at New York Public Library during the day, and then they're volunteering at Interference in the evening, who are doing incredible work around metadata. So to go back to the digital, Museum of the City of New York, Schomburg, New York Public Library, Brooklyn Public Library have all digitized so much of their collections. And I think it is part of sort of the archivist activist framework that's happening across the city. A lot of metadata is being revisited. So it all exists already. It is happening right now. And I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
I totally agree with all of you. I just want to put a shout out. Interference Archive was founded by Brooklyn College. Woo! Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to just put this sort of as a speed response. But if any of you could sort of, you know, give a little bit of, if you could give one piece of advice to the students here in the audience, if they're interested in going into archives or public history, what's, in like a couple of sentences, what's that one piece of advice you give? And I'm just going to do it for all. So Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I would just say that archives as a field has become very competitive recently, and it's very difficult to get a job in New York City. So if you want to stay in New York City, I would say take every opportunity you have to get an internship, to volunteer, to learn about everything, because you need to make sure that your resume does not end up in the circular file. What's going to make them interview you and bring you in to learn about you, as opposed to the other 50 or 100 applications that they've got.
Right? Any other thoughts or advice?
I was just going to say find your mentor. Truly find your mentor. There's enough of us out there. Send that email. Don't be sort of shy about sending that email. Like, we are more than happy to try and put you in touch with folks if we can't do it ourselves, let you know what's out there. So don't ever feel like it has to be a formal process if you're applying to a program. If you like somebody's work in the city, reach out to them.
It's kind of to second that, which is like, go, as much as emails are awesome, and Zoom meetings are perpetual, but helpful. Go to events, go to things, and don't be scared to talk to somebody. The number of times I just was like, so I have a question, and particularly when I was younger, and I would just ask somebody like, hey, could I help? Is there something I can do? And people were almost always like, yes, or. So sometimes just go to an event, go to a place. If there is a senator or a community that you admire, go and just be present and get to know people, because I think everybody is looking for ways to engage. And I think that can be another really meaningful way. And I would second that mentoring, like, ask professors, but also, a lot of professors want to help and want to make a difference in their students' lives and help them do.
I second all of that. So thank you. We're going to move on now to questions from the audience. So here's a great time to ask away.
Thank you all so much for doing this. I have been reading Prithi's wonderful book, Brooklynite, so I'm here to recommend that highly and just go right out. And I wanted to ask you to comment on one part of it that I was just finding especially moving. We have a current situation about who gets to vote. And you have a whole section about the draft riots and the ways that recent immigrants who were Irish got angry with blacks who they held responsible for slavery in a very peculiar way. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the linkage you make between a time in Brooklyn when, of course, women couldn't vote, and there was a property requirement. You had to have $250. And then guess what? There's a draft, and if you pay somebody, $300 to take your place, so rich men didn't have to fight. So I wanted to ask you how you reflect on the current situation where money can control who gets to vote and how current so please read the book.
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you for reading the book. I get asked a lot, sorry, I'm not trying to not answer your question, but I do get asked a lot. I'm clearly not from around here, right? My accent is from somewhere else. I grew up in Liverpool, England, a very proud Scouser, and I am of South Asian descent. And I do get asked a lot by New York City, what brought you, A, to New York, and B, to doing this kind of history, by which they mean the history of free black communities, of enslaved peoples of African descent in this city. And I think my argument would always be shared history, shared struggles. If we can figure out moments of commonality, if we can figure out ways in which our histories overlap, my hope is, very hopeful person, even right now, is that we build a better tomorrow. And I think what happens in that moment is that Irish New Yorkers, Black New Yorkers, Irish New Yorkers specifically, forget their common struggles with Black New Yorkers, and so it becomes a blame game. It is what happens constantly in moments of capitalist crisis, right? You blame whoever feels like small fry or little fish. So if anything, I hope that story illustrates what does happen when we don't know our histories, when we don't know each other's histories, and how actually we overlap.
Yeah.
Other question. Can be about anything. Don't have to have read her book.
Yeah, you're good.
So I feel
like you've addressed this within your, where do archives come from? Where does this material come from? Like, how do you get a hold of it? You know, if I'm interested in something, what do I do?
Great question. Who wants to take a stab at it?
Well, just in terms of Brooklyn College, how do we get this stuff? We're an institutional archive, so a lot of the stuff comes to us, organically. That we are that repository for the history of Brooklyn College, president's records, and things like that. But we also actively go out and collect. Archives have collection policies, and try to add to the material that we have. It's not easy to find things in an archive, and that's why I always say to people, even if the archive that you're going to might not have what you're looking for, talk to the archivist. Look at us like as if we're just another reference librarian. You go to the reference desk, you're asking a question, you have a research topic, come to us, we will help you, because it's not that easy to find where things are held. Even in this digital age where a lot of guides and stuff are online, there's still a lot of things that are hidden. So we are your best resource. Your professors are your best resource. The bibliography in a book, and they'll say like where they actually went and got things. When I first started working in the archive, we'd get letters in the mail of just people fishing from all over the road. Do you have this person's papers? And now I get emails the same way. So it's something that archives have to work on in terms of accessibility and making our collection what we have more known and what other places have more known, and what we have to offer any type of researcher.
Can I just add something in there too? Because I'm the materialist in the room. I like to call myself the cultural material girl. Sorry, that was a really bad Gen X moment that just went flat.
I got it.
Thank you. Objects, right? Your archives are also all around you. The city that you walk in, we've been around for a while, right? And even before the colonists came. So the archive is not only just the papers and the wonderful things that are kept with love in spaces that like our archives, but also all around you. The objects that you have, the buildings that you walk into, the spaces, the parks, the trees. I know a woman that I work with as a colleague who's looking at trees as sort of institutional memory holders, right? So there's different ways to think about an archive in a sense that you can even be in more, to use sort of the words that you've been using, in communion with them, right? And that it's something that can be accessible for all that I don't think people really realize.
Hello, I'm not a history student or anything like that. I just graduated the urban sustainability program, but archives have been an interest to me, especially when the current administration, when I've been doing research on environmental issues, when some of the websites had just vanished, and I had to scramble and just try to add everything to web archive and everything like that. So it's always been important. And the Brooklyn College archives have always been useful. And so I'm wondering, since I want to do some of this work, if possible, what would you recommend someone like a layperson to do? What would you want a layperson to do in terms of helping create archives or assisting or anything like that?
That's a good question. Any thoughts in the room?
I'll start with one, which is: are there groups or projects? Are there groups already that you have connected with?
I'm just getting into the interference archives.
Oh, great.
That's great.
And my most recent archive visit has been the Brooklyn College Library. You guys have the tree book or whatever it is. I tried digitizing the mapping it or whatever, but yeah, it was super useful, but I haven't really gone into it, at least physically, so I don't really know how to get there.
Well, I think part of it is starting to, if you're working with the Interference Archive and other things like that, is starting to build those relationships and connections, because even if you just graduated, like you're just on the beginning in many ways of a journey. And so if you connect to people who are interested to come back to the library, all of those things will help kind of send you on your way. So I would say I would start with some of those things. I mean, there is more formal training one could do. So there's like formal piece, but there's also a lot of informal work maybe that one could do.
They're making you run today.
All good. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with here. I'm from Queensborough Community College in the Gallery Museum Studies program. And also I worked on this historic museum, a memory space for Holocaust survivors and speaking and researching genocide. And one of the issues that I'm seeing, I'm in a more professionalized conservation space. So when I think of archives, I'm always thinking of how can we preserve our archives, how can we protect our archives, either preventatively or even in the instances of having naysayers or people with ill intent coming in to destroy our archives. One of my biggest issues right now in my institution is that we have a plethora of objects and artifacts from World War II. And, again, I am still starting my journey, so I don't always know the best practices, and oftentimes it is the fight between physical preventative and preservation and also digitization. So sometimes I just want to kind of pick your brain about where can some of us who are working in these institutions, just as interns, as fellows, is there programs that we can start looking into to help really, our issue in my institution is that we actually have no formal catalog. There's no formal system of our holdings, so it's kind of going in the bag and scurrying and trying to find what it is, so we don't actually have a holistic understanding of what our collections are to even work on future exhibitions for our institution. So I just want to pick your brain about, especially for those early, smaller institutions who mainly only have one or two people working on them, and sometimes they're dealing with histories that are constantly in contest with different groups of people. Where do you guys, what programs, maybe what methods of cataloging and managing catalog systems are you guys thinking of?
Ooh, that's a good one and a tough one. Lord knows I'm definitely dealing with that here at Brooklyn College with our archive collections. From my personal experience, every place that I've worked with has had a different system, which is great because it makes it unique for that institution. It's bad because it means it doesn't really talk to other institutions quite as well, right? So I think first and foremost, just finding what kind of program would be best and most useful for your collection and for the institution. There's also that idea of cost, so you got to consider components like that. You could go super, super basic and do an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, that's pretty much, yeah. And then, in some instances, those can be easily transferable into other types of programs like Past Perfect, though not many Past Perfect that much anymore. The New York City Archaeological Repository actually uses an Access database. So, I had to scourge, our computers here to get someone to put Access on my computer because I'm working with one of their collections and we're sort of testing out one of their databases. But it really kind of depends on what your needs are and your budget, unfortunately, and other kind of components. But starting small and working your way up, I think as long as you have something that's working, rather than going back and scourging, I think would probably be really, really useful. In terms of training, that might be something that Marianne could talk a little bit more about, but there are master's and PhD programs that you can get in archives and library studies here at CUNY, but also in many other institutions. And we're hoping that the minor, this is another plug, is a sort of an extra bonus or boon to people's resumes when they apply for those types of programs, because Marianne stated it's becoming more and more competitive, and so hoping, this minor will help the situation.
We have time for one final question.
There's one
I
last.
just want to shout you out and say, like, this colleague of ours could have asked ChatGPT that question,
Yeah.
and she would have gotten an interesting answer, but the live connection between these 4 panelists and the live network is what's going to get her a job. That's my plug.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us and for being here. And also, hi, Professor Britt. See you again.
Good to see you too.
I, no quick answer probably, but I just kind of I'm always the type of person who maybe existentially thinks a lot about just more in general why humans are kind of and I try to also be optimistic briefly, but I'm just why are we doomed to ourselves sometimes? And I wonder if ever, your research in archives helps you to kind of cope with that necessarily. Maybe it's not a short answer, but do the archives ever help you maybe sleep better at night about humanity, or does it just make you constantly more and more anxious? Sorry, thank you.
That's a great last question.
I study a period in U.S. history in which slavery was legal, was the backbone, socially, politically, and economically of this country, in which abolitionists were considered radicals and crazy people. And I also study the history of ordinary people, right? I don't study Frederick Douglass. These were ordinary people, your neighbors, maybe you're of similar soil to them today, who were teachers and writers and business people who were organizing for a better future. So I think the inspiration is in the histories of New York City itself. Ordinary people have been doing extraordinary things since day one, started filling up the indigenous people. So yes, I find a lot of hope in the past, and definitely a lot of hope for
That is the place to end. I hate to say it, but let's end on hope. Thank you for everyone for coming, and for the Wolf Institute for supporting this, and just get out there and get into the archive.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Oh, you're welcome. This was fantastic. I wish we had more time. I could talk forever.